Hello, this is Dana Hogue, and welcome to the third lecture in my class, Agricultural Policy. Now, in the last section, we discussed market failures. The idea of a market failure is that it's the necessary condition for government to intervene. In other words, if the market's working, don't mess with it. We don't want the government to intervene when there's really not a market failure because the economic paradigm that we're working with assumes that the market reaches the best solution when there are no market failures. So, for example, if I wanted to be in the NBA, I wanted to be a basketball player, and I'm only 5 feet 10 and I can't jump very high. Plus, I probably have no talent. If I tried to be a basketball player, the market would let me try. It would say, if that's what you want to do, go ahead. And I might try and try and try, and I might fail. But sometimes people that don't look like they could be a basketball player succeed. There are basketball players in the professional leagues that are quite short, and they still succeed. So we let the market decide whether I want to take that risk. An alternative model would have been that I let the government decide. The government looks at me, decides what my attributes are, and says Dana will be a basketball player. Now, of course, the reason we don't like that is it's hard for the government to really know what I should be because it's not only a function of my abilities, but it's a function of my interests and my perseverance. So we try to really let the market work when it can. Of course, I preface that again with as long as there are no market failures. Now, if you doubt this, you can look at the handout I provided on free markets, and you can look at why we really believe that the market is the best way to go as long as there aren't market failures. Now, we've talked a lot about this, but the market failure is a necessary condition, but it is not sufficient. Let's just take an example. Suppose you fix some market failure by creating a policy, and the solution is even worse than the original problem. This happened in the case of alcohol prohibition. Alcohol is bad. It has some bad things. If we let the market just work, people sell alcohol, and we say, well, let's not sell alcohol to people that are too drunk or that are driving. The market's really not going to do a good job at regulating itself. So in the 1930s, we stepped in and said, well, let's stop that, and we'll create a policy on prohibition. We won't let anybody drink. And of course, that didn't work so well. I've provided a handout on prohibition, but bottom line is that the prohibition, in other words, the situation after the policy was actually worse than the situation before the policy. So that didn't meet our sufficient condition. So therefore, a market failure is really not sufficient because there are government failures too. Now, you probably know people who believe that the market is evil and corporations are evil and really we need a lot of government intervention. You probably know other people that think just the opposite, that the government is incompetent or perhaps even evil, and we shouldn't let the government do anything. Now, economics sort of falls in the middle on that spectrum. We look at the situation, and sometimes the market does a better job, and sometimes the government does a better job. So again, we look to see, the default is that the market works best. If that doesn't work, then we look at changing it by intervening with the government. If the government solution is better, then we meet the necessary and the sufficient conditions. Now, of course, I've been talking about government failure, so let me give you a definition. It's really the failure to implement a policy fairly, effectively, or cost-free. So let's just take the example of cost-free. A government might fix a problem, like one that's kind of in the news right now is healthcare, but we might argue that even though it fixed it, the cost was way too high. There are lots of problems the government could fix at a price that we're not willing to accept. Another example is the government might intervene and it might fix a problem, but it might create some inequity somewhere. So we wouldn't want to live with that. So you can rewrite this as the sufficient condition is when the market failure is greater than the government failure. So before we have a policy, we have a market failure. After we implement the policy, we have a government failure. If the situation afterwards is better, then we say we meet the sufficient condition. Now, in reality, most situations have a little market failure and a little government failure. So you start, a lot of times that confuses my students. In that case, start from where you are. Wherever you are, you have some market and some government failure. If you create a policy, you create more government failure and less market failure. That's the only comparison you need to be worried about. Now, just like I did in market failures, I provided you 4 examples of market failures and asked you to try to use those when you discuss market failures. I'm going to do the same thing for government failures. That is, I'm going to list 7 kinds of government failures, and I'm going to ask you to try to keep your examples in those categories. The first is implementation. The second is unintended side effects or consequences. The third is competency. The fourth is fairness. The fifth is cost effectiveness. The sixth is bureaucracy. And the seventh is employee sovereignty. Now let's take a look at each of these in more detail. Now it's a bit hard to cover all these concepts on slides, so I give a lot better explanation in your course notes. So let me discuss the first 5 kind of briefly here, and the last 2 I'll spend a little more time on because they're a little harder to get. So let's start with the first one, implementation. This just simply means that policies are not implemented as intended. We pass laws, for example, and they never get around to implementing it. So, for example, when we pass a farm bill, we pass maybe 100 different laws in there, and we never get around to implementing many of them. A lot of times that's just because we don't have the money to do it. Congress passes a law that says everybody shall do something, or the police shall do something. If the police departments around the country don't have the money to do that, they're not going to do it. So many policies just don't get implemented at all, or they get implemented in a way that really doesn't do the job. The next one's unintended side effects or consequences. Something, in this case, something is affected that was not targeted. For example, if we raise the minimum wage in this country, some people are going to lose their jobs. That's certainly not our intention. Lots of times when you do a policy, you have an unintended consequence. Another example is a situation I'm aware of with airplane batteries. When airports take their batteries and they work on the airplane and take a battery and it's done, they used to take that battery to the dump. And the dump would then take that battery and recycle it. They would take the lead and some of those things out of it and then throw the rest of the battery into the dump. The Environmental Protection Agency created a law to try to protect this, where they said that if you're going to collect those hazardous materials out of a battery, you have to apply for licenses and so forth for hazardous waste. What happened was that the dumps then, many of them, the private ones, couldn't afford to collect the materials out of the batteries, and they decided they just quit doing it. Well, the next day after that, somebody brought a battery in. The dump didn't do that anymore, so we just simply dumped the battery in the dump. So all those hazardous materials ended up just in the dump, ready to be leaked out at some later date. And that was not the intent of that law either. Now, we talk about competency. I want to be careful here because I use a lot of inflammatory words in this class, and that I don't mean them to be inflammatory in this sense. So, for example, when I say the government is not competent, I don't mean that the government is incompetent. I mean that for the job they're being asked to do, they can't do it competently. The government gets asked by its citizens all the time to fix problems that we just can't fix. Probably the most contemporary one right now is maybe gun control or immigration. We're all mad that the government doesn't do what we want it to do, but some of us want less guns and some of us want more guns. How can it possibly solve this problem competently? Another example that you might relate to is, do you think there's any university policy that could totally stop college students from binge drinking? I know here at Colorado State University, they're doing a lot to try and stop it in sororities and fraternities. Do you really think they're going to have success? I really doubt that universities have the competent or have the tools to make that happen very effectively. Now the next example is fairness. The policy is not fair is all that means. So for example, when we pass a policy, it may be helping the people we want, but it may be unfair to somebody else. So for example, I asked you to look into subsidies, and I asked you why we have subsidies in agriculture. A related question would be, why do wheat producers get subsidies while sunflower producers do not? So you might say these programs are unfair. Cost effectiveness is the fifth of the easier things to explain. Probably most of you don't need an explanation here because we all know the government's not very cost effective. They're not exactly known for that. We simply mean here that the policy costs more than it's worth. So typically the government spends more to get any particular job done than it would cost if they hired out the private sector. You may have noticed that many government agencies hire or outsource their janitorial services. That's actually less costly than providing their own janitorial services. The bottom line here is, as I've said before, if we implement a policy and we achieve our goal, but the cost is not worth it, then we wouldn't do it. For example, a lot of people wish we would have a mission to Mars. If I told you that that would take the entire budget of the United States for 10 years, so we couldn't have anything else, you'd probably say that isn't worth it. Consider the case where the government takes over healthcare. I know this is a touchy subject, but let's just talk about it in kind of generalities. Before moving on, make a short list of what the government would need to do in order to run this program. Things that are needed that are not needed in the private sector. I'll pause for just a moment. Okay, let's move on. Don't worry if you don't have too long a list, or just pause your computer if you need to. Now, of course, I can't see your list, but wouldn't we need a new government agency to oversee such a program? That would mean buildings, people, office supplies, travel. We would have to have a whole agency just to oversee this program that we wouldn't really need to have if we had individual doctors and different insurance companies running the program. And wouldn't that cost a lot of money? Could these bureaucratic costs be more than the gains from government-provided health care? If so, we don't meet the sufficient condition. This is what is really occurring with the healthcare questions that we keep wrestling with in the United States. A lot of people believe that the costs of government-run healthcare are simply not worth it. They believe that while we would provide healthcare for more people, it would simply cost too much and drag down the healthcare for everybody else. Other people believe, no, the government failure would not be less than the market failure. The market failure being that some people don't get healthcare, and they believe this would be an overall good move. So one thing I want you to realize is we all have different ways of looking at and weighing these situations. So in the long run, or in the end, when I say, for example, that the healthcare program may be worthwhile, you might say it isn't. And we're both right in the sense that we're both just weighing costs and benefits differently. Now the next one, the sixth one, I need a little more time to explain. That's bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy, of course, is red tape or the cost of a bureaucracy to run. So, for example, the Division of Motor Vehicles or the Environmental Protection Agency or anybody that's a government agency has costs to run. Now, bureaucracy is a concern because every problem the government solves requires a certain amount of bureaucracy to implement that solution. The bureaucracy costs money. Now, studies show that bureaucracy can cost almost nothing. In other words, it doesn't cost very much at all for the government to run a program, or it could even cost up to 100% or even more than that on top of the program being delivered. Meaning that if you're delivering $1 worth of benefit, it's costing $2 to deliver. Now, we call this extra cost marginal excess burden. The term marginal is because it's extra. In other words, if the government provides one more unit of health care, that's marginal. If it's excess because it's on top of program costs. It's not just the cost of providing one more unit of health care, it's those extra bureaucratic costs on top of providing that extra unit of health care. And we call it a burden, of course, because it's a negative thing, it's an effort. Now, even though costs can range quite a bit, studies show that excess burden ranges typically from maybe 30 to 60%. So if the government provides health care, if it were 100% marginal excess burden, it could cost $2 for every dollar provided. The extra cost pays for salaries, offices, paperwork, buildings, travel, and all the other things it needs to run this program. So even if people could provide health care at the government level better than the private sector could, they have to overcome this bureaucratic burden. In this example, which is just totally made up, they would have to provide at least $2 more of benefit than the private sector does for every dollar in order to even break even, because they have bureaucratic costs they have to worry about. Now, one thing I think is kind of interesting is there was a study on agriculture, and it found that it costs $1.40 to give $1 to a farmer in the price and income support programs. So we could say in government failure, if we want to provide a subsidy of $1 to a farmer, we have to spend $1.40. 40 cents is the marginal excess burden or the cost of bureaucracy. Now, the last kind of government failure that also needs some explanation is employee sovereignty. Sovereignty means freedom to make your own choices. Employee sovereignty refers to the idea that government is made up of people and people have free will. Their will does not necessarily match the will of the people. In other words, if I work at the Environmental Protection Agency, I may or may not agree with the president who's calling the shots. Another type of government failure is that people within those agencies won't work together on a single-minded government cause. I always like to think of it as a jar of marbles. Suppose we have a Republican president and you work for the Environmental Protection Agency. You might think of all the marbles in a jar being the employees of the Environmental Protection Agencies as being red marbles. In other words, they should be doing what this Republican president has decided EPA ought to do. Then a Democrat gets elected. Magically, all the marbles are supposed to change over to blue marbles. So everybody in the agency does what this Democrat president wants. Now, it's not hard to imagine that realistically, these marbles in this jar, some of them always will stay red no matter who's president. Some will always stay blue no matter who's president. Some will swap depending on the president. And some will be some shade of purple, some combination of blue and red. The bottom line, though, is an agency can't be effective if people in it don't have the same goal as the agency. This is called the government failure of employee sovereignty. Now, the last step in determining whether the government should intervene then is to compare the government failure to the market failure. And as I indicated earlier, we don't always agree. You know, in this example, we have looked at market failures for price and income supports. We did that in homework number 2. In homework number 3, we did government failures. So you might just put down a couple of market failures on a piece of paper, and then put down a couple of government failures on a piece of paper, and answer the question, should we have income support programs? After comparing these market failures to the government failures on this piece of paper, ask yourself, is it worth offering subsidies to ag producers through these programs? Now, this is just a simple exercise to help you understand. And of course, everybody is going to have a slightly different opinion. And some will say subsidies are a good thing, they're worthwhile, and some will say they're not. Now, I've created a handout that summarizes the 4 kinds of market failures and the 7 kinds of government failures for your convenience. I want to make a side note. There's a thing called political failure, which is a close cousin to government failure. Government failure refers to the broad case when some set of individuals misuse or monopolize the legitimate use of force by the government. So, for example, a group of contractors convince a politician to pass a bill that gives them more work, more government work. Or we might start a war so that people can sell more guns. Political failure is a narrower concept. That's a subset of government failure, and that's where the power to control is misallocated in the political system. In other words, it's really not the same as a government failure. It's just saying that the politicians that are in charge can pull some shenanigans. This could be as simple as an incorrupt or an incompetent politician. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is sources of government failure. There are many, of course, but a few culprits that come to mind are ignorance, influence, and competency. Ignorance is, of course, always an issue because policies are made up by policymakers, and policymakers often lack the necessary information they need to make good policy. No one can really know. A lot of things that we do in government are so complicated, we just don't know whether they ought to be done. Should we have rescued the economy in the first part of the Obama administration? Some people argue that the funds that were paid out, the $1 trillion of funds, or however much they were a good thing. They helped the economy. But really, the problem is so complicated. It's really, I think, beyond anyone to decide whether that we really made a difference. People will give evidence that we made a difference, or they'll give evidence that we did not make a difference. But really, it's really hard to make that decision. When we ask the government to, say, solve gun control, does every policymaker really understand why people want guns, or why people want there not to be any guns? Or do they really understand the Constitution well enough to understand where their limits are? We wouldn't have a Supreme Court if that were the case. So one big source of government failure is just simply that people can't know everything. They can't know all the facts. On top of this ignorance is influence. Now, this is where policymakers are subject to pressures from various stakeholder groups. This leads to 2 problems: corruption or rent seeking. So what happens is stakeholder groups, in other words, citizens in the United States, they might get some benefit if the government were to enact a policy that was favorable to their position. That's called rent seeking. So the stakeholders want to influence a policy to go the way they want it to go. Now, as they do that, they try to influence that policymaker. If the policymaker gets influenced in a way that's selfish for these stakeholders, that's a government failure. The other thing, of course, is the politician could simply be corrupt. It's easy to influence somebody when they're willing to take bribes. Lastly, a source of government failure is competency in our leaders. I don't really need to say any more about that because I don't think politicians enjoy a very positive image right now. In other words, A lot of people think they're not very competent at this time.